we move on to geopolitical tensions, mitigating global risk in your portfolio. This will now be a fireside chat with the moderator Adam Ward, Director of Geopolitical Insight and Counsel, and Radoslaw Domagalski, CEO Rafaco. Unfortunately, Dr. Kim Zietlow was unable to make it today, so it will be more of a kind of formal fireside chat, and we'll be asking questions to the audience as well. Thank you. Can I please ask Adam and Radoslaw to come to the stage? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope I'm audible. Sorry. Okay. I'd like to welcome you all to this session. And as was just said, we're really here to think about geopolitical... Okay. I think it's working now. So welcome everybody to this session where we're going to be thinking about geopolitical risk and specifically how to factor it into strategies for investment, how to think about developing resilience in investment strategies towards geopolitical risk. This conference as a whole, this AIM meeting, has been based somewhat on the premise that we're undergoing paradigm shift. And I think it's fair to say, to my mind at least, that in the area of geopolitics, that paradigm shift is definitely here. I think there was a time in the last 30 years after the end of the Cold War when geopolitical risk was something that was episodic. Crises came, crises went. Geopolitical risk was also localized. It tended to be perhaps confined to emerging markets and frontier markets. And I think the shift that we've seen in the last few years is that really, far from being localized, geopolitical risk is now ubiquitous. It's actually moved into the center of the developed economies as well as the emerging and frontier markets for reasons that we all know. And instead of being episodic and occasional, I think for that reason it's become a permanent feature of the landscape. And the reason behind this, as we know, is the return of big power competition, great power competition as the dominant theme of geopolitics today. And we've all been reminded that the consequences of this competition can be to produce very significant systemic level shocks. The Ukraine war, of course, is being fought out on a limited number of battlefields in a certain geographic space, but it is also being played out in a global economic battlefield where sanctions are the weapons, where trade restrictions are involved, where supply lines and supply chains have had to be ripped up, where geopolitical contests are creating inflationary pressures that are dampening consumption and reducing the return on investments. So just to get this discussion underway, and before turning to my colleague, it seems to me at the macro level, there are potentially three different things going on that are shaping the overall global operating environment that investors and businesses have to think about. One is, and I'd like you to respond to these if you may. One is this notion that a process of geopolitical fragmentation is being mirrored in economic fragmentation, that connections, linkages are essentially now being diminished, and political alignments is what shapes economic alignments. And with that, some people see the risk not only of decoupling between major economies like the US and China, but a wider risk of globalization going into reverse. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is related to that, is the increasing role of the state interventionism in the economy, in some ways for national security or political reasons, the relationship between the state and markets being redefined. So we have industrial policy, sanctions I've mentioned, enormous subsidy regimes in strategic sectors like technology, energy, and other areas as well. So the question there is, how far is that going to go, and how do investors navigate that? And then finally, I think at the corporate level, we're seeing a number of challenges that are really about how many markets can you simultaneously operate in successfully, given these tensions, these geopolitical tensions. Can you keep a foot in China and in the US to the degree that it was possible previously? And if you look at a number of big companies that are under pressure now to diversify their production locations, to pull out of China to some extent. Apple is a classic case there, but it's also visible in everything from minerals to chemicals and other sectors as well. So, do you see that as the macro trend, or do you see a sort of a different future that investors need to think about?
Absolutely. Actually, geopolitics is kind of business, right? It's part of the business right now, and we see this in our operations. In fact, in the last 3 decades, we had, let's say, golden time of development and golden time of globalization. I remember the time doing business in China. Chinese policy of the Chinese government was to promote development, sustainable growth and reasonable development. Now, a few months ago, Chinese government announced new approach, new policy, and the priority is to promote security, national security. The same in European Union. Food security, economical security, energy security is the key driver of politics. Of course, it influences the business very much, and currently the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, must be at the same time Chief Geopolitical Officer, in fact. It means that the board levels discussions must include the discussions about the current situation in different regions, impact on the business operations and so on, because geopolitical means for business the risk, significant risk, in different meanings, like risk of sanctions, which influence the business very much, direct risk of geopolitical risk of regulations, constraints of trade, and indirect costs like fluctuating prices of logistic, supply chain, and so on. So, in other words, in my opinion, board levels must include into internal discussions all this geopolitical or political influences on the business. How to mitigate those risks? First of all, CEO must understand the situation, must have an interest on geopolitical situation in the regions, operations, and understand what is the relations between decision of the policymakers and impact on macroeconomy, impact on logistic, and impact on the daily operations of the business. In the previous years, we could enjoy free trade. We could enjoy unlimited exchange. Currently, the politics or geopolitical issues are the part of the operations. Second approach, which seems to be reasonable for me, to diversify the business, diversify in terms of supply chain, diversify in terms of investments. Thirdly, important thing is to closely cooperate with the governments, own governments. A lot of Western countries offers insurances of for investments, for export, for operations. So the close cooperation with the governments can mitigate the risk of the, operations in different regions. In case of my company, for example, what we try to do is to involve governments into some operations in Asian countries, for example, to have state insurance, to have state support, to promote business on the ground of state agreements. So that's kind of approaches which boards can implement.
So you're based in Poland, and obviously Poland is could be considered to be a frontline state in one of the key areas of geopolitical tension right now with the Ukraine war. And you've sort of also laid out what you think the ingredients at the board level need to be in order to have a resilient strategy. But do you think that has been, I mean, it's adopted in your company, but do you see that happening in other companies and other sectors in reaction to what has been happening in Europe?
Of course, Poland and other Central European countries are pretty much affected by the conflict in Ukraine because of the sanctions. So the possibility to import some raw materials like gas and others is limited, significantly limited. Many of the Polish companies were forced to shut down its business in Russia. Many of the Polish companies and European companies had to close the business in Ukraine because we are neighbors, of course. So the significant part of the international exchange was based on import and export with Russia and Ukraine. So we have to relocate and to reorientate our export, our import, and it seems it's a stable trend, and possibly the opportunities to go to Asia, to go to the Middle East.
I mean, I'm interested by the way in which the impact of geopolitical risk has spread in terms of what companies do. I mean, there's the obvious impact of physical security of operations, and as conflict risk increases, obviously more precautions are going to be needed to be taken, including, as you mentioned before, in terms of diversification of supply lines on a just-in-case basis. The other way, of course, related to that is how business models can be completely upended by geopolitical factors. But it seems to me there's a third element here, which is certainly in the West becoming more prominent, and that is the reputational aspects of having a strategy around geopolitics. In other words, the notion that geopolitics is the second G in ESG, and that if you want to attract investment as well as make investments, if you do not want to fall foul of regulatory authorities or indeed of public opinion, then you need to have an approach towards geopolitics that is also sustainable. Is that something that you've observed as well?
No, absolutely. But what is important in this situation? This is not a temporary situation. We have to be aware that geopolitics influence every aspect of the business, and we have a geopolitical shift in these years, which will have an impact for years. We don't know what's going to happen in Europe in terms of trade with China. We can expect that we can expect some limitations in terms of deep cooperation with Chinese companies. In terms of investments in China, we see decreasing numbers of Chinese investments in Central Europe. We see limited interest of the Central European companies to invest in China, and of course investments in Russia is reduced to zero almost, but it means that international and multinational European companies must entirely re-evaluate approach to investments. That's why diversification in terms of investments, it seems critical chance for the companies.
And do you think governments are sending clear enough signals about where they would like you to invest and where they consider to be off limits? I mean, I think, to my mind, there is a degree of inconsistency and mixed signals often, especially with larger economies that obviously have grown up under globalization and depend very much on foreign trade. I mean, in the case of Germany, for example, where exactly the pendulum will settle in terms of its approach towards investment and trade with China, I think is yet to be determined.
You know, actually, business traditionally prefers to keep away from the government relations, because in the good time it's better to do business according to away from the government relations. In these days, cooperation with government agencies, government offices, it seems to be necessary. Government's role is to facilitate trade, to reduce the risk for the investments, both overseas investments and domestic investments. So the role of the government is now critical. The closer cooperation with the government agencies, the better, because that's the very good way to reduce and mitigate the risk.
But I'm wondering, in a situation where the sheer number of sectors which governments are now considering as being strategic in nature or as having a national security implication, whether governments themselves are still performing the role that they traditionally have, or whether they see their mandate as widening and widening. I think I saw something in The Economist a few months ago that suggested that technically 60% of the US stock market is strategic sectors now. And this seems to be an enormous expansion and possible interference of the state on the basis of geopolitical priorities and national security goals. And so it seems to be a growing phenomenon.
Correct. And the role of the government in strategic sectors is higher than ever, I think, at least in Central Europe, especially that this is one of the tool to stimulate the growth, the country growth. The percentage of government's investments is 20% higher than in the last years in Central Europe, in Poland. It means the government invests most of all in strategic sectors like energy sectors, infrastructure sectors. All of those sectors are protected by the government, stipulated by the government, and the role of the state companies is also increasing, obviously.
I mean, obviously, at times of geopolitical change, the disruption often manifests itself chiefly in terms of risk. But do you think it's possible also to look for maybe upsides is too strong a word, but opportunities? If companies are feeling under pressure to restructure their supply chains, does that actually present the flip side of an opportunity for new markets and building new relationships in ways that otherwise would never happen?
Absolutely. Actually, of course, for the business, private business especially, the current situation is a huge challenge, but it's a very good opportunity to be closer to the government, to take advantage of the different governmental projects, to be the part of the large-scale investments in the energy sector, nuclear sector, infrastructure sector. Governments put a lot of money into economies right now to stimulate the economy. It's a great opportunity for the private sector as well to be the part of these large-scale programs.
So, I sort of take away from what you've been saying that if we're thinking about best practice elements, one would be don't put all of your eggs in one basket in terms of investments. I guess another one would be to assume that there's now a permanent risk premium on investments and not a temporary one. Get access to good expertise. Make sure you have obviously country experts, but people who can also see how events in one part of the world transmit to another potentially. And as you say, mainstream and completely embed a consciousness of geopolitical risk into what the board does and what the board is thinking about.
Mindset of the boards must be changed, actually. Mindset means that CEO and senior level in the companies must understand the situation, must understand the consequences, the impact on from the politics to economy to business and so on. So the more opportunities to participate in the forums like here in Abu Dhabi, the better, because that's the forum, that's the way to exchange opinions, to understand the changing world.
Yes, I think from my perspective, something which I always try to get across is that the world that we're living in now is in such rapid flux that the task of prediction as to what might happen next is becoming much more difficult. And often when people are looking for geopolitical analysis, they want probabilities that are reduced to percentages. But I always say that geopolitics essentially is an expression of human psychology. It's not something that is easily quantifiable. In a sense, the financial markets are also an outgrowth of human psychology. But in geopolitics, the scope for irrational action is actually higher than I would say it's in the financial markets or investments, because the investor always knows that he's looking for a return. But in the geopolitical world, action contrary to self-interest is a lot more prevalent. So what you should be doing in looking to the future and developing the kinds of strategies to build resilience is, I think, really more in the domain of scenarios analysis or simulations through which you can stress test your business model and make sure that in any eventuality you have a sense of what the impact will be, but you also have contingencies to deal with it.
Absolutely. Business must participate in the debate with its governments. And this voice from the business should be included in this debate about directions of the politics, regional politics, local politics, and so on. So business it's not the part of the pure politics itself, but business should should be the part of this debate.
One element of the debate is, of course, the question of choosing sides. And I think that seems to be both at the state level and at the corporate level an increasing dilemma. You can be part of Block A or part of Block B or C, and activity across them is becoming more difficult. So how do states avoid getting trapped in a binary choice? And how do companies continue to make the case that despite obvious political differences, there are still, there's a case to be made for engagement at the economic level? Do they need to change what they're doing?
It's extremely difficult. It's extremely sensitive. That's why the knowledge, education, and experience is the key to in a reasonable way be the part of this discussion with the governments, with representatives. The business in my country, at least, we set up a lot of associations which are kind of representative of sectors, branches, and that's the good forum to communicate with the governments, communicate with European Union and other public institutions.
Okay, thank you. So I think we're coming to the end of our formally designated time, but it would be really great if there were any perspectives from the audience, or any questions, or anything that could lead us towards the thing that we're looking for in terms of a perfectly resilient investment strategy. Does anybody have any comments to make? We have a roving mic. It's been a long day, I can tell. Okay. Well, in that case, I think we'll wrap things up there. Obviously, I expect this is a subject that conferences like this will return to on an increasingly frequent basis, unfortunately. But in the meantime, thanks very much for coming along, and
Thank you very much.
for your comments today. Thank you.
Thank you.